In the late summer of 1889, a stockman and part-time trapper named Leander Dillman was working the high pine country south of a young town site called Bend, Oregon, when the ground opened underneath him. He did not fall far. What he found, once his eyes adjusted, was a passage of black rock running away into the dark in both directions, wide enough in places to swallow the beam of a lantern before it ever touched a wall. Dillman used the opening the way a rancher uses whatever he is given. He lowered venison into the cold air below to keep it through the warm months, and for more than 3 decades the hole in the pine flats south of Bend belonged, in the loose way such things belong to anyone, to him. Word of it spread slowly, the way word spread in a country with more cattle than telephones, and more miles between neighbors than most Easterners could picture. By the early 1920s the hole had a name, Dillman's Cave, and a small, uneven trickle of visitors willing to climb down into a 42-degree chamber with nothing but a coal oil lantern and a coat, most of them locals, few of them leaving so much as a signature behind to mark that they had come. Then the name changed, and in the same stretch of years that the name changed, so did the ground around it, in a way that has never been fully explained to the satisfaction of the people who still ask about it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The record on the name change is not as clean as a state park sign makes it look. Some local accounts hold that Dillman was convicted of a crime in 1921 and that the county, uncomfortable attaching an outlaw's name to a natural landmark, simply stopped using it. Other sources, including the state's own geological literature, simply note that the cave was renamed in 1923, the same year a state geologist arrived to study it properly for the first time. Both things may be true at once. What is certain is that by 1923, the hole in the ground south of Bend carried a new name, Lava River Cave, and a new kind of attention it had never had under Dillman. That attention came from Ira A. Williams, a geologist working for the state of Oregon, who climbed down into the tube with survey instruments instead of a lantern and a rifle. Williams measured what Dillman had only used. He walked the passage in both directions from the entrance, recorded its width and height at intervals, and produced the first known map of the interior, a document that in its basic outline is still close to the one visitors are handed today. He called it, in his own report, the Lava River Tunnel, and he described a chamber running northwest under the pine flats for well over a mile, formed when a river of molten basalt, poured from a vent tied to the volcano later mapped as Newberry, drained away downhill toward the Deschutes River and left its outer shell standing empty behind it. Williams' report did one more thing, almost as an aside. It described the pine country above the tube, the same stand the Shevlin-Hixon lumber company was actively cutting through that decade, as scenery worth protecting. That single line, buried in a geological survey nobody outside a state office was likely to read, is the thread that connects everything that happened next. The volcano behind all of it, Newberry, is not the kind of mountain most people picture when they hear the word. It has no single dramatic peak. It is a broad, low shield roughly 20 miles across. Its floor collapsed into a caldera holding 2 lakes, ringed by hundreds of smaller vents, cinder cones and fissures that have erupted on and off for something close to 400,000 years. The flow that produced Lava River Cave was one small event inside that much longer history, a single tongue of basalt running northwest from a vent near what surveyors would later name Moxed Butte, cooling on its outer surface into a hard skin while the molten interior kept moving downhill toward the Deschutes River. When the eruption ended and the remaining liquid rock drained out through the tube's own mouth, it left the hardened shell standing empty, a tunnel with nothing inside it but cooling air, waiting roughly 80,000 years for a trapper's boot to find the one weak place where its roof had finally given way. What Williams mapped, and what still exists today, is a lava tube a little over a mile long in its main run, with a smaller southeastern branch extending roughly a quarter-mile further, closed to visitors even now for the loose rock overhead and the bats that winter in its dark. At its widest, the ceiling rises 50 and 60 feet above the floor, high enough that a lantern held at arm's length barely grazes it. The walls carry a smooth, almost poured look in places, a glassy grey skin geologists call reentrant lava, formed when the last of the molten rock inside the tube remelted the walls around it, as trapped gas pushed through before the whole system cooled solid. Further in, the floor breaks into small dune-like ridges, local surveyors named sand gardens, wind-blown sediment that has washed down through cracks in the basalt roof for thousands of years and eroded, grain by grain, into miniature badlands no taller than a boot, a whole slow terrain carved out in the dark by nothing more dramatic than water and time. In winter, the entrance chamber fills with ice, sheets of it forming across the floor and columns of it hanging from the ceiling, cold air pooling in the low tube, the way it pools in a cellar, unable to rise back out through the narrow collapse above it. That ice was not a curiosity to the people of Early Bend. It was infrastructure. Before mechanical refrigeration reached Central Oregon, blocks were cut from the cave floor, hauled up by block and tackle, packed in sawdust, and freighted into town to keep meat and dairy cold through the summer months. For a working generation, the lava tube functioned as the town's icehouse, and the practice stopped only when electricity made the labor of hauling ice out of a hole in the ground unnecessary. When that labor stopped, it stopped completely. The block and tackle came down. The sawdust packing sheds at the entrance, built to insulate the cut ice, long enough to reach town by horse and wagon, were dismantled or left to rot, and within a generation, almost nothing above ground, marked where an entire small industry had once operated out of a hole in the pine flats. Visitors today walking down the metal staircase built into the collapse pit see no trace of the winches, the sledges, the packing sheds, or the paths worn by wagon wheels hauling frozen blocks north into Bend twice a week through the warm months. The cave itself was never emptied of anything, since ice reforms every winter on its own schedule, regardless of who is or is not cutting it. What was cleared was the human operation built around it, taken down so thoroughly that a visitor with no prior reading would have no way of knowing an ice economy had ever existed there at all. The entrance itself is what gave rise to the story this channel keeps being asked about, the one involving loggers and a door. It is not on its face an unreasonable thing for someone to have said. The opening into Lava River Cave is a collapse pit, a place where the tube's roof gave way sometime after the molten rock inside had drained out, leaving a ragged skylight a person can climb down into. The basalt around that collapse cooled the way basalt often does, fracturing along vertical planes as it contracted, so that in places the rock breaks into long, straight-edged columns stacked one against another like masonry laid without mortar. Seen from the wrong angle, in poor light, with a lantern throwing shadows across a rectangular gap in otherwise unbroken ground, a collapse pit in columnar basalt can look, for exactly as long as it takes to walk closer, like an opening someone built rather than one the earth made on its own. According to an account preserved by more than one Central Oregon family and repeated at various points in local memory, rather than in any single archival document, it was in the summer of 1924 that a small group from the area, some of them said to be men, cruising timber for Shevlin-Hixon, came upon the collapse and described it, in the moment before they climbed down and understood what they were looking at, as a sealed stone door set into the ground. Whether that is the precise language anyone actually used in 1924 is impossible to verify now, and no family retelling of it agrees closely enough with any other on names, weather, or exactly how many people stood at the edge of the collapse that day for a documentary account to treat it as settled fact. What is documented, in the plainer record kept by regional histories of the cave, is that in that same year several people from Central Oregon found the tube and believed themselves to be its first discoverers, unaware that Dillman had already been storing venison inside it for 3.5 decades, and that the ground under their boots had already been given a formal name by the state. Shevlin-Hixon was, by 1924, one of the 2 largest timber operations in Central Oregon, running a mill in Bend, alongside its rival Brooks Scanlon, both of them built up fast after the railroad finally reached the town in 1911 and made it possible to ship pine lumber out to the rest of the country for the first time. Bend itself had barely existed a decade earlier, a scattering of a few hundred people around a river crossing, and by the middle of the 1920s, the two mills between them had turned it into one of the fastest-growing small cities in the state, its population climbing past 5,000 on the strength of ponderosa pine alone. The company cut across tens of thousands of acres of owned and leased land stretching south along the Deschutes River, the same ground the cave sat under, running crews out of seasonal logging camps that moved as the cutting moved and left almost nothing permanent behind them. Timber cruisers, the men sent ahead of the saws to estimate stand volume and mark boundaries, worked that country on foot and on horseback in small crews, filing field notebooks the company was supposed to retain for years afterward. If a cruiser's notebook from the summer of 1924 ever recorded a collapse pit resembling a door, no copy of it has surfaced in the Shevlin-Hixon records now held by the Oregon Historical Society, and no historian who has gone looking for one has reported finding it. That is not proof of anything hidden. Field notebooks from a working logging camp were not built to survive. Most were used hard until they fell apart and were thrown out with the rest of camp trash. But it means the version of 1924 that survives, the door, the rediscovery, the several unnamed people from Central Oregon, comes down to us almost entirely through what families remembered and repeated, not through anything a company or an agency wrote down and kept. What the institutional record does show, clearly and in writing, is what happened 2 years later. Williams had already flagged in his 1923 survey that continued logging over and around the tube threatened both its physical structure and the value of the country above it as scenery. Shevlin-Hixon, whether moved by that report, by a shift in public feeling towards Central Oregon's caves as the automobile brought more visitors within reach of them, or by some calculation of its own the company never fully explained in any surviving letter, made a decision in 1926 that ran against nearly every incentive a timber company usually answers to. It deeded 22.5 acres surrounding the cave entrance to the state of Oregon, land the company had every legal right to log, to be held instead as a state park. The deed is a real document, filed and preserved, the kind of paper trail a fabricated story rarely leaves behind. Oregon's state park system barely existed as an institution at the time. It had only begun taking formal shape a few years earlier, built more on donated scenic parcels along the new highway network than on any purchased or condemned land, which made a private timber company's gift of ground, sitting directly over a known lava tube, an unusually clean fit for exactly the kind of holding the young system was trying to acquire. It is, in the language this channel keeps returning to, the object that stayed. Not a relic pulled up out of the ground, but a signed transfer of land, sitting today in a state archive, recording the exact moment a company chose to stop cutting where a hole in the ground had been found. Here the story the internet repeats and the story the paper trail tells begin to pull apart. The version passed around online holds that the forest was closed to the public that year, that whatever the loggers found was sealed away from ordinary people by the same authorities who came to examine it. The deed says otherwise. The land was not closed. It was opened, formally and permanently, as a public park, 2 years after a collapse pit is said to have been mistaken for a door. Where other chapters on this channel have turned up genuine, verifiable acts of institutional withholding, this one does not. What it finds instead is closer to the reverse, a private company voluntarily surrendering ground it could have logged, so that a lava tube a trapper once used for cold storage could be walked by anyone willing to bring a coat and a light. If there is a suppression buried in this story, it is a small and almost administrative one, the kind that happens whenever a striking local account gets flattened into an internet-ready version with the details sanded off. The claim of a locked and hidden forest survives online. The deed sitting in the state archive tells a plainer and, in its own way, more interesting story about how one company's decision in the pine country south of Bend outlasted every man who signed it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Lava River Cave was not the only opening into the ground in the Pacific Northwest that changed hands and changed meaning inside this same narrow window of years. 250 miles south, in the Siskiyou Mountains of southern Oregon, a 24-year-old hunter named Elijah Davidson had followed his dog into a marble cave while chasing a bear back in 1874, half a century before Dillman found his own hole in the Pine Flats. That cave sat mostly unvisited and commercially unsuccessful for decades, passed between a string of private investors who each failed in turn to make it the tourist draw they imagined, until President William Howard Taft used the Antiquities Act to declare it Oregon Caves National Monument in 1909. Unlike the basalt tubes south of Bend, the passages under the Siskiyous were cut from marble, a metamorphosed limestone rare enough in western cave country that locals took to calling the site the Marble Halls of Oregon, its walls built up over hundreds of thousands of years by slightly acidic water dissolving stone into stalactites, stalagmites, and slow-growing flowstone, rather than by any single volcanic event. Administration went first to the Forest Service, the same agency responsible for the pine stands around Lava River Cave, and it was not until 1922, 2 years before the Central Oregon rediscovery, that a new highway finally made the caves easy enough to reach that visitor numbers began climbing for the first time in the site's history, nearly half a century after Davidson first stumbled into the dark chasing his dog. Just south of the Oregon line, a different opening in the same volcanic ground was drawing a different kind of institutional attention in that same decade. A Klamath Falls miller named J.D. Howard began exploring the lava tubes of the Modoc Plateau in 1917, tubes that had sheltered fighters of the Modoc people, under the leader remembered as Captain Jack, through a 5-month siege in 1872 and 73, 53 men and their families holding a natural stronghold of broken lava against an army many times their number, a genuine underground fortress rather than a figure of speech. The siege ended only after negotiations broke down inside the stronghold itself, a meeting in April of 1873, during which General Edward Canby, the Army's negotiator, was killed, the only United States general to die in the long span of the country's conflicts with native nations. Howard began exploring that same broken ground on foot more than 4 decades later, in 1917, and spent years afterward lobbying the Forest Service to protect what he had mapped. And in November of 1925, a year after the Lava River Cave rediscovery, and a year before the Shevlin-Hixon deed, President Calvin Coolidge proclaimed the ground Lava Beds National Monument, preserving both the volcanic terrain and the stronghold's battle sites together. 3 lava landscapes, Lava River Cave, Oregon Caves, and the lava beds of the Modoc Plateau, moved from private, informal, largely forgotten status into some form of public protection within a decade and a half of each other, all of it inside a broader 1910s and 1920s push toward automobile tourism and organized land conservation across the American West. None of the 3 required a cover story to explain the shift. Automobiles made remote country reachable in an afternoon instead of a week. A handful of persistent private citizens, a trapper, a hunter, a miller, did the unpaid work of finding what was there and telling people about it. State and federal agencies, carrying a new appetite for scenic protection after the National Park Service was created in 1916, said yes more often than they would have a decade earlier. What is consistent across all 3 sites is not a hidden hand keeping people out of volcanic ground in the Pacific Northwest. It is closer to the reverse, an era in which formerly obscure holes in basalt and marble were being pulled toward public access rather than away from it, with paperwork surviving in every case to show exactly when the shift happened and who signed for it. Even the roles repeat themselves without anyone planning it that way. A working man with no formal training, a trapper checking a snare line, a hunter chasing a wounded deer, a miller with weekends free, does the first unrewarded exploring, A state or federal survey follows years later to measure and map what that first person only walked through by feel. And a private landholder, a lumber company more often than not, ends up deciding whether the ground stays theirs to cut or becomes something the public can visit indefinitely. In all three Oregon and Northern California cases from this narrow window, that last decision landed on the side of opening the ground rather than closing it. None of this required the earth to hide anything from anyone. It required only that the ground had already done roughly 80,000 years earlier, something nobody walking that pine flat in 1889 or 1924 could have expected to find under his boots. Newberry's lava, draining out of its own hardened shell and leaving a mile of empty tube behind, is the entire mechanism. No sealed construction, no vanished builders, no order handed down to keep the country quiet. Obsidian flakes recovered near the entrance tell archaeologists that people were using this ground long before Dillman, long before any name was ever attached to the hole at all, evidence of an older, unrecorded familiarity with the tube that neither a trapper's dog nor a company deed had anything to do with. Ira Williams' 1923 map is still, in its basic outline, close to the map handed to visitors today. The 1926 deed is still sitting in the state archive. The southeastern branch Williams surveyed is still closed, not by order of any hidden authority, but by the plain fact that loose basalt overhead makes it dangerous, and that bats winter there undisturbed. The state park Shevlin-Hixon, carved out in 1926, eventually passed into federal hands as well, folded in 1981 into land managed by the Forest Service, and later absorbed, in 1990, into the newly created Newberry National Volcanic Monument, a designation that finally protected the volcano's entire caldera and its surrounding flows as a single unit rather than the scattered handful of separately claimed parcels it had been for most of the 20th century. And the entrance is still exactly what it was in the summer someone is said to have called it a door, a collapse in fractured basalt, cold air pooling below it, a metal staircase now built down into the dark where a rancher's boot heels once found nothing but open air. Every summer, tens of thousands of people descend that staircase with a rented lantern or a flashlight from the parking lot above, walk the mile Ira Williams first measured with a tape and a notebook, and stand for a moment at the bottom of a hole that a company once had every right to log over and chose, for reasons it never fully wrote down, to leave open instead. Anyone can still climb down and decide for themselves what it looks like. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.